Mrs. Robinson, if we can just deal with Afghanistan first. Are the rights of non-combatants being respected in Afghanistan as much as you'd like to see them being respected?
Well, certainly I give great priority to that. I'm very concerned about the civilians in Afghanistan who've suffered for so long, with 20 years of conflict, 3 years of terrible famine and drought. It was going to be difficult anyway. Mm-hmm. And now there is the military conflict that they are caught up in, that they're helpless in. And they're moving around internally. Some of them have come across borders, which is also difficult. And winter is coming on. And then I'm also very concerned now with a change in territory. And I have been saying very loudly and clearly, there must be no massacres of civilians, no raping of women, none of this pillage and taking it out on the civilian population when there is a change of territory in Mazar-e-Sharif or now in Kabul or any other towns. And I'm asking that those who can exert influence, like the United States and the United Kingdom and other countries, will make it clear that there will be no impunity, that if there is any targeting of civilians, that there will be trials, justice, imprisonment for this, and that nobody who's involved in this can take part in the future of Afghanistan.
Are you satisfied that so far in the war, human rights are being respected by the Northern Alliance in the areas that they're taking over?
It's difficult to know what the exact situation is. I know that there has been loss of life by civilians and damage to hospitals and old people's home in a certain case, and that's very worrying. It's hard to gauge because it's hard to know what the situation is internally. Mm-hmm. I've been very worried about cluster bombs. Mm-hmm. I saw cluster bombs when I visited the town of Nish in a working class high-rise area where there was no military target in sight. And I saw the shock and horror of the civilian population, and I could see unexploded cluster bombs nearby, and I really think they are not acceptable where there are civilians.
If we can just speak a little bit about the Northern Alliance, the alliance itself has a history of human rights violations. There are some who believe that the Northern Alliance, when it comes to human rights and a belief in international fundamental human rights, has a record which is no better than the Taliban.
I'm afraid that we are very concerned because we have been looking at a pattern of human rights violations, both by the Taliban and by the Northern Alliance, particularly when territory changes hands. And that's why I say there must be no targeting of civilians, no raping of women. Before the Taliban arrived, women in some cases had a very difficult situation, and there's a lot of violence against women. And we have a project in our office of mapping out a pattern of massacres when territory changes hands. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. There is a culture of impunity that has operated in Afghanistan, and that has to end now. And I'm saying again, there's talk of a broad-based coalition of Afghan elements to form a new administration. And there must be nobody who is a leader who has allowed a massacre or abuse of women or violations of civilians. Nobody of that kind can participate, I would hope, in a new administration. And that message should go out clearly.
What about, if we just look at the broader picture, what about terrorism in the region being sponsored by countries like Pakistan? What can the UN system really do if terrorism has a state sponsor?
Well, I think that the issues in relation to combating terrorism are both very complex, and my concern is in fact to ensure that whatever measures a government is taking, and governments are now implementing the Security Council resolution, that they would be done in a way that balances very firmly continuing support for fundamental human rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, the avoiding of long periods of detention without any process, no preemptive arrests. And I'm very worried about what countries in this region and elsewhere are doing.
If we can look at India, what about the Kashmir region? There seems to be some sort of a vicious cycle in place. There have been extensive reports of human rights violations by Indian security personnel, but their argument is that they're actually out to try and protect human rights.
It's a very difficult situation for human rights. I came for the inauguration of the South Asian Human Rights Group, and I'm really very pleased because I think it's a great development. But I listened to human rights defenders from both Pakistan and India, and they were urging on me the human rights dimension of the problem basically in Kashmir. And what is very difficult is that I cannot feel that I really have a possibility of properly addressing the human rights dimensions of the problem because of the deep political divide and conflict. There needs to be some basic framework of trying to move forward politically, and then we can all do more to protect and to secure human rights and human security. And I'm very troubled by the fact that it's not possible to do more.
One final question. Do you see a UN military force in place in Afghanistan as a post-Taliban regime comes in?
There is discussion, as I understand it at the moment, of a multilateral force involving troops from countries like Turkey and Jordan and Indonesia. In other words, a balance of different forces. I think it's recognized that it would not be appropriate for a UN peacekeeping force which does not have a military capacity to deal with situations of very severe conflict. If there is no likelihood of continuing guerrilla warfare and conflict, then you may have a UN traditional peacekeeping force. But as I understand it, there is an urgent focusing in New York on a system of governance, which is very necessary, and also a multilateral military force from the region in a wide sense that could go in like a counterpart, I suppose, of the NATO involvement in Kosovo, and under a broad UN approval, but not as a UN, strictly speaking, force. I am concerned about two things. One, as I've mentioned, the human rights of the civilian population, and they should be a priority. And secondly, that in a future government of Afghanistan, the people of Afghanistan have a big say, and more than half of those people are women. And they need to feel that they have a future that will be fairer, more equitable, and move progressively to really give them what they've never had, which is a proper protection of their human rights in the broadest sense.
Right. Well, thank you so much for speaking to Star News this afternoon.
Okay.
Thank you very much.